Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's my joy to be here.
We are really excited to hear about your research. This is something that we care so much about, and we were delighted to find out that it's something you've been working on for over a decade. So I feel like to get the lay of the land, it'd be really helpful for our listeners to just hear about the project that you're going on 12 years working on, I guess. So would you just tell us a little bit about how you got started and what you've been studying?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And down here in Little Rock back in 2012, I got really interested in how religion was affecting our community. And especially, it was an election year, and I teach political science classes. So we were interested in what was going on with religion and political decisions. So I wanted to get my students out of the classroom and into the community to see what was going on with that. And we started working with 5 congregations that year and asking them questions about how religion was affecting their political decision making and affecting the way that they saw the world. And after that, the project just started to grow. And it's a community based project. So we really have deep relationships in our community. We have a clergy advisory board. We listen really carefully to what the community wants in terms of the questions we ask and the topics we study. And in 2016, we expanded to work with 17 congregations. And in 2020, we worked with 36. So we've surveyed thousands of members and interviewed hundreds of clergy. We've done focus groups and we've conducted 7 in-depth case studies. And from all of this work, we've come across this one big takeaway message, which is that community engagement is good, that it really helps members, it strengthens congregations, and it helps democracy in societies as well.
I'm very curious about that initial kickoff that you did in 2012 during the Mitt Romney campaign,
Yes.
especially doing the work in the South. Did you encounter I'm just curious if you encountered anything interesting as it pertained to the survey participants and potentially voting for a Mormon for president.
Yeah, well, when we got started in 2012, we actually asked a lot of political questions and we asked people like straight up who they were going to vote for and their partisan identification and how strongly they felt about their votes. And we actually worked with a ward from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that year. And we also worked with a Black Protestant congregation. And so it was Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama that year.
Mm.
And we found that the Black Protestant congregation was much more strongly in the camp of Barack Obama than the Mormon congregation was in the camp of Mitt Romney.
Oh,
There was
wow.
Oh,
a little more
interesting.
diversity in terms of the choice there. We did have an evangelical congregation as well, and they were pretty strongly going Republican, so they weren't too torn up about their Mitt Romney vote that year. But what that year really told us was that people didn't want to be asked about their vote choice at church, and they weren't super comfortable
Wow.
with it. So in later years, we shifted our questions, listening to our community participants, and started asking more about their involvement in the community and the issues that were more important to them.
So when you say community engagement, do you include religious community, or are you talking about religious communities engaging in more like civically? Or are you saying that this is something that it feeds each other, that the more involved you are in the community, the more it's also benefiting your religious community?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking, especially because this is the kind of question that will let me nerd out on exactly how we measured this statistically. So, there's a bunch of ways that we measure community engagement. And so, one way is how much service you give. So, we ask people about the number of hours of service they give every month, both outside of their congregation and to their congregation. We also asked about when we surveyed and talked to the leaders of the congregations, we asked about the number of social service programs that they have conducted at their congregation. So there's all kinds of programs, like maybe congregations might have food pantries, or they might be doing like have a relationship with the local elementary school where they go over and adopt them and read to them or give backpacks to the kids, things like that. And then finally, we have like a battery of questions that kind of gauges people's own reflection of their community engagement. That's a little bit more civic. And so these are things like um, I talk with my friends and neighbors about community issues, or I do things to help make the community a better place. And what we found is that on all of those measures, when people have higher levels of engagement, you see positive outcomes from that. And so the positive outcomes we see is at an individual level that people are happier, they have higher levels of life satisfaction, they're healthier in terms of mental and physical health. And in terms of their religious outcomes, they feel closer to God, they feel a greater sense of gratitude, they feel a deeper sense of peace and well-being in their lives as well.
Wow, this is
Yeah.
so interesting. As Latter-day Saints, I feel like this is a strong suit in some ways because we are basically our entire wards are run by volunteer hours. You know, all of that is engagement and service. But in some ways, I wonder if we get a little bit isolated and so because I could see how you could feel like, okay, I show up and I'm running activity days every week, and that's a lot of hours that, you know, every Tuesday. And so are you seeing the same benefits as communities where you're reaching out and volunteering in you know, across the community? You know, is all service created equal, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there is really something special and different about getting outside of your own religious community and giving service beyond that and engaging beyond that, thinking about issues that affect people more than just your own religious community. So here in the South, people talk about getting outside these four walls and getting out
Mm,
beyond into the broader community. And that's where we see, I guess, the real magic happen. And especially the real power comes when you do that kind of engagement with the people from your congregation, because that's when you
really?
see the benefits at the next level for the whole congregation. So when you're serving and engaging outside of your place of worship, you see benefits coming back to the place of worship. So you're going to see that in higher attendance. People will come attend worship services more often. You'll see it in higher levels of giving, and you'll see it
Wow.
in, we have a measurement of congregational warmth, which is like how close people feel with their congregation, that they say things like, my congregation feels like family. I can talk to my pastor about anything. I would want to bring someone here to attend worship services. All those measures of congregational warmth are higher when people are getting out into the community and serving, and especially when
Together.
they're serving together. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's
So
so
for the
interesting.
it is for the congregations that do this particularly well, do you see do you see it typically driven by leadership? Um, you know, in a Mormon congregation, you know, that would be a bishop or bishopric potentially saying like, we're gonna do this together, or does it happen more organically, or some mix of both?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on the culture of the congregation. Some congregations have a more bottom up culture, but lay leaders are really, really important here because something that I have definitely learned is that clergy are really, really busy. As someone who keeps
Mm,
trying to get them to sit down for interviews, they're really, really busy. They're trying to, write sermons and visit people in the hospital and, keep the lights on and all of those things that they're doing. So if there's a member of their congregation who says, this is an issue out in the community that I really care about, maybe they've had a family member who's fallen sick and they really care about the Ronald McDonald House and they want to organize a bunch of members to get together and serve a meal at the Ronald McDonald House. If they come to their clergy leader and say, we should really do this, that clergy leader will be so excited to say,
mm.
absolutely, lead the charge, have a committee. You know what? Maybe we'll find a budget line for you, like make it happen. Lay leaders are so critical to moving that community engagement forward because the leaders of the congregation tend to be stressed and stretched a little bit thin. But what the leaders are really important for doing is framing the issues. And this really
Mm.
connects to the politicization of so many issues, is because any issue that we can think of, somebody could turn it into a political issue that could potentially divide a congregation. And it's up to a
Wow.
leader to say, this is actually a spiritual issue. This is actually a religious issue for us to engage on, not a political issue.
Okay, when you say lay leader, are you talking about like lay members of the congregation who are choosing to lead out in this however they'd like to serve versus clergy? Because this is a little bit confusing because since we all of our leadership is lay leadership, right? So you're talking about people just feeling inspired and going to clergy and saying, well, I want to participate in this way. Is that the differentiation you're making?
Yeah, so
Okay.
the population that I work with in Little Rock, we did survey and work with wards and congregations of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but the vast majority out here are not from that faith. So there's
Yeah.
lots of Southern Baptists and evangelicals and Black Protestant churches and Catholics and Muslims and Jews and Methodists and Episcopalians, and all of them have paid clergy. And so
Okay.
the lay leaders in those faiths would be the people who are just attending and who are not
Okay.
paid staff.
Okay. Oh, I like that. We should just, if we all thought of ourselves as lay leaders, we have some sort of responsibility when we show up to be looking for the things that fire us up and bringing that to the people who are running our wards so that we can organize better. I love that. Not waiting for somebody to say, this is what we're going to do. I've spent a lot of years in Relief Society activities committees, and it's my favorite calling. I genuinely really I love Relief Society and I love activities. But something that I've always noticed for every year that I've spent on these, organizing activities is that there's kind of like this low level anxiousness about that we should be serving, we should be doing something meaningful, and everybody can feel it. And I feel like in every opportunity that I've had to do this, it's been really hard to find meaningful service. And so I would love for you to just talk about what that looks like. Like, what's the difference between service that is really impactful, that is probably more relationship based, as opposed to these one-off activities that are, I want to say they're easier to plan, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily easier. Like I think it's just different. And I've always had this mindset that we're looking for, something we can do in 2 hours, and we need it to be in this month, and we're all going to show up, and we need to be able to do it together in this time frame. And so that really like limits the type of service that you're able to do together. But we have all this power. Like, we have all these people who are willing to give their time and resources. And so I really feel like it would be valuable to understand what meaningful, impactful engagement can look like in a congregation where people are willing, but maybe it's not the norm, or maybe it's harder to get off the ground because we're used to these sort of one-off, like one and done activities that feel like service.
Yeah. So I think that it depends on the congregation and it depends on the culture of the congregation. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that you've described really well what sometimes might feel like the service culture
Mm-hmm.
of our congregations. Um, in the book, there are 7 case studies of different congregations in Little Rock and how they are engaging. And so one of them, which might look like really meaningful service that you might have in mind, is an evangelical congregation that is in downtown Little Rock. And it's kind of a commuter congregation. So people are coming to attend there from outside of downtown, but they're right next to, a poorer neighborhood and right near an elementary school. And the 20-something group at this evangelical church has decided to like adopt this neighborhood. And they are a couple of people who work at the elementary school and kind of adopt that elementary school. And for the past couple of years, every single Saturday, they show up to the park that's right there. And they bring food, they play with the kids in the neighborhood, they walk around, they check on the elderly, they bring food to them, they help them change light
Wow.
bulbs, and they just like are there consistently showing up and building relationships with them. And so that's really building relationships. But I have to tell you that even after years of doing it, there are still people in the neighborhood who I interviewed and talked with for the book who are like, we'll see. We'll see if they stick around. Like they're still a little bit
Wow.
skeptical. So it takes years to build real relationships.
Wow.
But if we're talking about what our goals are for meaningful service, when I talk to the individuals from that church who have been doing this service, the change in them and the change in their hearts has 100% happened. So one of those leaders said to me in her connection with one of the community leaders who lived in the neighborhood, she said, this woman, she's never been to church. She doesn't know Jesus like I know Jesus. But when I come out here and see what she's doing twice as much than I'm doing to try to live like Jesus lives and to try to serve like Jesus serves. And so when I see her and get to work with her and interact with her, I'm learning so much more about Jesus just by getting to know her.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really
So I
cool.
think that just by serving, we're changing ourselves.
Yeah.
And the more we can do that in relationship, I think the more that change will happen. But even if it is a little bit of service that we can do that gets us outside of ourselves, we'll see
Mhm.
that change start.
Awesome. So you wrote an article that was published in the Desert News this summer that makes the argument not just that it's beneficial to serve together as congregations and there are many benefits, which there are, um, but that we can sort of maybe help to stem the tide of polarization, by attending and worshiping together, but also by serving together. And I think this is a major thesis of your book that was published this summer as well. Could you talk a little bit more about how this type of activity can benefit us in that way in this pluralistic democracy?
Yeah, so one of the findings of the research and the data that we collected for over a decade is that when there are ideologically diverse congregations, so when you have Democrats and Republicans worshiping together, that actually makes for the congregation to be a warmer and stronger place. And this is a little bit surprising to some people who
Yeah.
have read the book or read the article, to say, hold on, are you sure if you put Democrats and Republicans together in the same space, I'm pretty sure they'll just yell at each other. But that's actually not the case, because for most congregations, most of the time, people just want to come together and have a community. They want to worship together. They want to have an experience that brings them closer to God. Most of the time, they don't want to talk about politics when they come to worship services. They just want to be together and want to have a spiritual experience. And when you especially get them serving together, then they start seeing each other as real people instead of as political opponents. And that builds a greater sense of warmth and a greater sense of community. So, in fact, we measure political diversity in a couple of different ways. So, political diversity, we ask people to put themselves on a ideological spectrum from, liberal to conservative. And then, not to get too statistics nerd on you, but then we took the standard deviation. And so the bigger the standard deviation, right, means that the more people were all over that spectrum. So the more diversity there was in the congregation. But then we also asked the congregation leader, is your congregation politically divided? And the more that the leader said, yes, there's political division here, the more you saw that congregation warmth take a nosedive, the lower attendance became, and the less people were willing to give service to their congregation.
Mm.
So, political diversity within the congregation is really a good thing for the congregation.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm curious. You said, I mean, and this is true of me too. I think most of the time when I go to church, I want to have a spiritual experience. I don't necessarily want to be thinking in political terms. And yet you're saying that political diversity, as I understand it, is a good thing that contribute to that sense of warmth and community. But does that depend on us keeping politics out of the meeting house, so to speak? So is it that we want diversity in the congregation, but we're sort of like not going to talk about it? Or maybe that's not the most charitable framing, but I'm curious.
Well, I think what our data shows is that people don't want partisanship in their places of worship. So
Mm.
they don't want to talk about specific candidates. They don't want to talk about specific parties, but it is okay. And in fact, it's actually good to know that the people that are there with you are believing different things than you. In
Mm.
fact, not to get too theological, but I would say that, like, that's the body of Christ, right? If we all were exactly the same, that's not what a congregation needs. They need people from different perspectives to be sharing different things. And if everyone were exactly the same, that's, you're not going to have a strong congregation. So the
Yeah.
congregation actually does better when people are aware of the fact that you have a diverse congregation.
Yeah.
I feel like my experience is that it usually comes through as sort of an undercurrent, and I think it's easy to sort of accidentally be scanning for where people might fall in the political spectrum when they're, especially where we have so many opportunities to speak as regular members, that you're at the pulpit, you're raising your hand, like there's a lot of conversation happening on a Sunday, and so it feels like even if it's not explicit, it's something that really seeps into your regular Sunday worship. So I would just love to hear what I guess advice for, when you're sitting in a Sunday school class and somebody says a word or says something where it's a giveaway and you know that you feel like you have them pegged, and when you feel yourself close off to that or resist that or like push it away, I hear what you're saying, that like that might be healthy community, but can you just talk about that moment? What is it when you're sitting in a class and you feel like you've recognized some distance because of something that's come up that's maybe just seeping into the conversation, not even explicitly political, but it's seeping in, and it makes you feel like an outsider, or it makes you want to push somebody else out. What can we do in that moment to keep warmth in the room?
Yeah. Well, in that exact moment, you may feel like you also need to make a comment to make sure that people in the room feel like it is a place where everyone is welcome. But if it's not a threatening or dangerous comment, it's just a comment that makes you feel like, oh, that's someone who is very different from me. I'm not sure that we would get along. What I would encourage you to do, if your faith community is a place where you really are invested in and where you really want to stay for the long term, I would say that the next time, if that person needs a meal, for you to be the first one to sign up. And the next time that you're doing one of those activities for 2 hours you're going to be assembling hygiene kits, sit next to that person and start a conversation with them. Because the more you're able to serve with them and to see them as a real human who loves their family, who loves their community, who is going to take 2 hours of their day to try to help other people, the more you have experiences like that, the more you're going to see that they are contributing good to your faith community as well. And that they have a spot there and you have a spot there. And all of you together are helping to make it stronger.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people who, let's say, this situation that Aubrey brought up seems to like come up over and over? You go to church every week and you hear these comments that you consider to be, if not dangerous, at least like somewhat morally problematic. And it can be really exhausting to feel like you're the one that needs to raise your hand and address that and walk that line perfectly every time. Some people do this very naturally and very well. Aubrey, I would say, is one of those. Some people sit and stew, instead of saying anything. And I really love your idea of like, maybe you don't need to say anything there, but there's another way to interact with this person that will bring you closer to them. But what's interesting too is you said if you're committed to staying there long term, and yet it sometimes is these types of moments repeated over the course of many months or years that can decrease your desire to stay somewhere long term. So for somebody that, let's say they are in that situation of just like, they've raised their hand a lot, they've tried to continue to participate, but they feel like they're feeling really tired.
Um, well, as someone who has an expansive view of the gospel and lives in Little Rock, Arkansas, this is definitely an experience that I can relate to. And I would say that something that I think both is present in the data and that I have experienced in my own life is that there is a lot of good and joy that comes in that service and engagement outside of ourselves. And also, I think because we see in the data that what comes from that is a deeper relationship with God, a deeper sense of gratitude, a deeper sense of peace and well-being, that can kind of be an anchor to your soul when it feels frustrating to hear comments that kind of jar with your understanding of God and of the gospel. But when that love of God is anchored in your heart because of your service and love of your fellow beings, it makes it a little bit easier to withstand those challenging Sunday schools.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, I always feel this impulse to create echo chambers everywhere I go. Like, I just want to collect people who will keep validating how I feel because it's just easy, it feels like a relief. You get like a dopamine hit when somebody just completely thinks that you're right, and so I think what your work has illuminated a little bit is that in worship communities where we have this common ground of a love of God and of our fellow men, it makes sense that this is a place to really practice staying anchored to what matters and being curious about where we disagree. And I know, Tim's bringing up points where something feels actively problematic, but I think on a day-to-day basis, I feel a lot of resistance to things that I don't necessarily define as morally objectionable. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for stretching like that in my church community.
Yeah, I think sometimes in some spaces we need that, where everyone is a cheerleader for us. And I think maybe in our close knit friend groups we can try to find that. But I think that in our broader communities, there is a real need for diversity. And I think that that's actually like how human beings were designed.
Mm.
And when we see really homogenous congregations, those are the congregations that in fact are shrinking in the data. Like those are the ones who
Really?
are not getting more members, who have lower attendance. They're the ones who are they don't have like the innovation and the engagement out in the community. They're the ones where people are less, they actually feel less of a sense of community there because they're not being engaged and having to like think and having to really have a challenging experience. And so one thing that I would say that has been a real blessing for me is doing this work. I've been able to attend worship services all over the city from many different faith traditions. And that interfaith work has been amazing. Like I
Mm.
have felt the spirit in all kinds of faith traditions, and that has stretched me and grown my testimony and grown my faith in so many beautiful ways. And I think that can kind of be like a corollary, right? When there are different people and who come from different perspectives and have different testimonies, but who are still all trying to be closer to God, like that is beautiful to come into contact with. And so the people who are in our worship spaces with us are trying to get closer to God too, even if they're
Mm.
doing it in a different way than we are. And maybe it would feed your soul to get out and do a service project with people from a different faith tradition. Or one of my favorite things to do is to share a Ramadan iftar dinner with
Mm.
my Muslim friends, especially on the first Sunday of the month when I have also been
Oh.
fasting, and to share those faith traditions together.
Oh,
I
that's
love
so
that.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's been my experience too, is that it's not just possible, but likely, I think, when you sort of take very seriously the faith of others to feel a spirit, as you put it, and to feel spiritually fed. I'm curious, as you've participated in and seen all these different congregations, different religions, different styles of worship, if you've come to some sort of thesis about the part of the vineyard that Latter-day Saints might be particularly
Mm.
good at, or something that we as a people could be called to. And that's very much not to discount the other parts of the vineyard, but when you look at this holistically, what makes you say, yeah, we could really tackle that, as Latter-day Saints?
We are very good at taking care of our own members. We're really
Mm.
good at our community. We're
Mm.
super good at like making sure that when somebody's sick, they get fed. If somebody's not showing up, they get checked on. When someone has a baby, that they have meals delivered. We're really good at taking care of our own community. In general conference in October 2022, President Oakes gave a talk about how we could do more to engage with and also just acknowledge and respect the work that other faith traditions and other organizations are doing in terms of like
Mm.
humanitarian relief and engagement all over the world. The church does amazing things there, but there are so many others who are engaging that we could partner with, that we could work with, and that we could just acknowledge. But in terms of hours of service given to our own congregation by so many what I would call lay leaders, and in terms of taking care of our own people, we do fantastic at that.
Mm.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I was at this a conference at BYU just a few weeks ago, and it happened to fall over Sukkot, which is a Jewish festival, and part of the celebration is that you eat in a sukkah, which I hope I'm saying all these words right, but it's like a little structure. It's celebrating it commemorates the 40 years of the children of Israel in the desert and their temporary shelters that they used. And so you build this structure that has a lot of specifications. And because this conference fell over the festival, the organizers built a sukkah for the Jewish attendees. And then all of their meals they had in the sukkah. And it makes me like teary to think about, because it just like required so much effort. Like there was so much respect just flowing for these people and their tradition. And and it just looked like it must have taken so many hours and a lot of Googling or conversation or something to figure out exactly how to do this. But they did it. And so on one of these afternoons, we got to have lunch together in the sukkah, and I felt like I could just feel my heart just bursting open. Like it was the most interesting opportunity to just have a conversation about the way we all connect to God. And I think I've read a lot about Judaism and I've watched some stuff and listened to some things. And like I've never had the experience of just being in conversation and hearing about like why this festival is meaningful and what this structure means and why are there candles. And it was just the most beautiful heart knowing. It was like the opposite of just really being in my head, which is usually the way I am learning about something. And I could feel how much it stretched me, and also just how much even more respect I felt for this tradition and for this people whose lives are anchored to it. And I anyway, so I this interfaith stuff is really resonating with me. I think it gives a little bit of clarity just because language is new. Like you hear about the way people connect with God, but they're not speaking your mother tongue. And so it's like you can almost see it fresh in your own life when you hear somebody else describe it in their own way. And I think that's such a beautiful opportunity that I haven't totally embraced and I am so curious about. So I really appreciate that you're bringing that up. I know we're going to start wrapping up, but what I really love for people to have from this interview is like a to-do. Like what if you're just like so on fire and you're thinking, I definitely want to do this. I want to be a lay leader and I want to find ways to serve meaningfully and not just help with the polarization in my own ward, but just, to really feel like I have roots in the whole community and I want that warmth in my ward. What's the first thing? Like, how do you find meaningful, impactful service that you can commit to as a ward? And how do you get started with interfaith work in your own community?
Absolutely. I would say start a conversation with your ward. So there may be people, maybe it's a activities coordinator, maybe you want to chat with
Mm,
your bishop, maybe there are people in your ward that would be a good place to start. But then I would say like look within your own circle of influence, especially if you are in a community where there are other communities of faith around you, other congregations who may be involved and engaged in the community. Look to partnerships with them because they may
mm,
already be doing something. Maybe they have a food pantry that you could go volunteer at. And then you'll be making connections and building relationships with other people and also participating in a project that's already ongoing. So you don't have to start it
mm.
from scratch.
Wow.
Maybe there's someone who is in your life or in your sphere of influence who is already engaged with a nonprofit. And maybe that nonprofit could really use, a dozen volunteers once a month that you could
Yeah.
help bring. So think about the people who are in your sphere of influence and the organizations that you could partner with and plug into that are already working. And almost every city has an interfaith center that
Mm.
you could go to their events, show up, help out. They would be thrilled to have you. So those are some good places to get started.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
I have one more question for you too, Rebecca.
Yeah.
As Aubrey was describing the conference that she went to at BYU, where the folks at BYU constructed the Sukkot and am I getting excuse me, constructed the
The
sukkah.
sukkah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um that it's really, really cool. And I feel like it's the kind of thing that I'm hearing about more and more. And maybe, I'm, obviously in certain circles and maybe this isn't like happening society wide, but it feels like a couple decades ago that probably wouldn't have happened. And I'm hearing more and more about this type of thing. And like there seems to be even or perhaps especially in Latter-day Saint circles, a growing respect and deep interest in other traditions, which I think is just awesome. I saw the Bhagavad Gita right there behind you, which I think is really cool. And I guess what I'm wondering about though is, and like I said, I fully welcome that, and I think it's amazing. I don't think we're seeing the same corollary exactly in politics, where a Republican looks at a Democrat and says, "Wow, I really love what you're bringing to the table," or vice versa. Often, it's like it's very um, interspiritually, it's feeling more and more to me societally like we're on the same team, and yet politically, we're not doing the
Mm.
same doing the same thing. Can you think of any ways or have any advice on how we might start to engender that same growing respect for people who are sort of across the political divide from us?
Yeah, I think that it's really tricky. Right now, I think there's a lot of division, there's a lot of animosity. I think that the best thing to do is to come to our places of worship without political labels on as much as possible, and
Mm.
to engage with each other as humans. And I think that the more we can engage serving our communities and serving side by side, the more we'll get to see each other as people who are trying to do good in our communities. So I'll give just a small example. Here in Little Rock, we have a city that is pretty evenly divided along racial lines, geographically and demographically. Little Rock was a city that back in the day had to be forcibly integrated by the National Guard because the city and the governor was so against the Brown v. Board decision. And those historical scars run through until today. And so in our city, there's a particular zip code that has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. It's for Black women, it's maybe 3 times what it is for white women, which is just devastatingly high and unacceptable. And one of the congregations that I profile in the book is Bullock Temple. And they're a Black congregation that is super involved in the neighborhood, has a food pantry, shares information about health, is really engaged. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a program to help educate moms and help reduce maternal mortality. And so I was able to connect these two. And this Saturday, we're going to be out like handing out information in the neighborhoods and helping to spread the word so that women can sign up for this program that'll be housed at Bullock Temple and will be partially funded by the church and through other nonprofits. Now, some people might come to this and say that's a political move, or like that feels like a Democratic policy, or that feels like a Republican policy. But the church leaders are framing it as helping those in need and a religious responsibility to care for people who need caring for. And that kind of community service, I think, is the kind of thing that is going to bring people together, congregations working together, trying to help people, and without putting politics on top of it. And I think the more we can do that, the more those political divisions that we might feel like they're in our congregations will start to fall away because we'll connect with each other as real humans.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been really important and helpful for me personally. Is there anything you feel like we should have asked, or anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
The only last thing I'll share that I'm super excited about in the data is that young people are the most excited to engage and serve and
Really?
volunteer. So we see that in the data. I thought it was such a cool finding because there's kind of a
Wow.
stereotype, especially about like, older people at churches are the only ones doing service. But in fact, we saw that people born after 1980, so our millennials and our Gen Zers, are the ones who are giving more hours of service to their congregation and outside their congregation. And when we asked
Wow.
them about whether they were willing to serve on any variety of community issues, more than any other generation, they were the ones who said that they wanted to get involved. So younger people are really
Wow.
looking for more meaning and more engagement from their places of worship. We do see less identification from the younger generations with organized religion, but I think that these data show that what they're really looking for is that meaningful engagement, Aubrey, that you've been talking
Yeah.
about. So they want
That's
to engage, they want to
incredible.
serve. Yeah.
That is so interesting because I can imagine how we might be shooting ourselves in the foot, right? By thinking like there's less identification, and so we need to make our asks softer, like
Mhm.
require less, and maybe we're doing the exact opposite because what younger people are looking for is like something that feels like it matters because and something that does matter, real impact. So that's really incredible. That's so interesting. Thank you so much. This just feels so timely, and we really, really appreciate your work and the conversation.
It's been a joy to be here. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Rebecca Glazier. You can find her new book, Faith and Community, on Amazon. And Rebecca also has a really useful discussion guide for congregations that's available for free and linked in the show notes. It'd be a great way to get started if you're interested in exploring how, as a ward, you might get involved in your local community. And we would love to hear from you, so leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can reach out to us at info@faithmatters.org.